So this first chapter is an introduction to special education and all of the services that go along with special education. I will be posting all of my slide decks in um, the agenda for each week, so you will have a chance to not only access the links, but also download the PowerPoint if you choose to do so. I do encourage you to go in and check out this quick video about KidSpeak. Excuse me, and basically it is told from the perspective of children who are in special education who seem like they're probably in maybe first, second, probably at the most third grade, I'm assuming, and they share just advice to teachers, parents, school administrators about how to interact with them since they are in special education. The older students' perspective is exactly what it is, an older student's perspective, and these students look like they're in high school. And they tell their experience and they give tips to educators and parents about working with them as well. So key terms from chapter 1 are handicap, diagnosis, disease, disorder, and disability. These 5 terms sometimes get used synonymously, and in reality, they are truly different words. Handicap, I'm starting off with that one first because a lot of times people will say that people are handicapped, when in reality, a handicap is the limitations an environment places on an individual. For example, I asked the question here, how can an educator address this issue for a blind student? Well, if you are teaching a class or you have a daycare facility and you find out that you have a student who's blind, or a student shows up and they are blind, because that happens as well, you need to make sure that your walkways, your spaces are accessible, meaning that they meet the dimensions provided by the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, when it comes to the proper dimensions for passageway. They need to be able to pass down the aisles of the classroom. They need to be able to access your desk as well as the chalkboard. Anywhere that you're allowing the students to go, the individual with the disability who's in a wheelchair or walker also needs to be able to go. And so in regards to answering this question, how can an educator address this issue for a blind student? It is the educator's responsibility, according to many laws like the ADA, Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act, to provide accessible documents. And when I say accessible, meaning the student who is blind can access the information in the same way, at the same rate as his or her peers. So what is a diagnosis? A diagnosis is something that is given by a qualified medical professional and or a licensed professional. And it can be, anything that severely impacts the life activities of an individual. So the diagnosis comes because, somewhere along the line, the person may share that they feel something's wrong. Like with my me having to wear glasses, it basically became a diagnosis because I started complaining that I couldn't see the board. The teacher noticed that I was squinting a lot. My mom noticed that I was, putting my head closer to the paper to either complete work and or to read. And so from there, she realized that, I needed to go to a doctor. Obviously, they sent me to an ophthalmologist. And from there, I got a diagnosis for myopia. And so now I wear glasses to help me gain as much of a 20/20 vision as possible, which is what is considered the norm. So what is a disease? A disease is something that affects an end organ, and an end organ is something that you need in order to live. Your heart, kidneys, all of a sudden I can't think, brain, things of that nature. Disease, anything that affects your end organ is considered a disease, and it causes deterioration. You can die from diseases. The next term is disorder. A disorder you cannot die from. However, it is something that can sometimes work alongside with the disease to further impact a person's functionality. So what is a disorder? A disorder is something that impairs your ability to do something. It could be a reading disorder. And so instead of being able to read the information as it's being spoken or being written or as you're reading it, you may have issues with processing that may jumble the words. You may have a hard time focusing on the words. Sometimes people with dyslexia will talk about how the words will move or the letters will move and interchange. So in their heart, they see, you know, HELP, but their brain processes it possibly as HPLE. And so then, of course, that doesn't make any sense because that doesn't, you don't even know how to pronounce it. So if a person with dyslexia and it is impacting them in that way where the letters shift on them, you know, may have anxiety, which also is which is also excuse me, which is also an disorder that could impact the way a person learns. So when is a disorder considered a disability? A disorder is considered a disability once it impacts one of your major life activities. So what are your major life activities? That's anything that you need to do in order to live. So breathing, eating, drinking, education is considered a major life activity because we use education obviously to further our development, not only on a personal level, but also on an education level, as well as, on a personal level, but also as a career level. So, you know, we go to school so that we can learn things, and then at some point, you choose a career and or a trade, and then you continue to educate yourself so that you continue to grow in your craft, basically. And then there's disability. And like I said, it's anything that impacts one of your major life activities. What services are available for students with disabilities in K through 12? Well, that information, those services will be everything that we unpack in this course. So that could be anything from an individualized education program, which is the IEP. And I will be using a lot of acronyms in this course, and is mainly because in special education, which sometimes you may hear people refer to as SPED, SPED, there's just a lot of terms. And so, I mean, who has the time to say special education when you could just say SPED or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, you know, when you could just say ADHD. So acronyms are something that is very, very helpful in special education. If you're familiar with IEPs or you've seen an IEP, you'll notice that it too has a lot of acronyms as well. So the services that are available for students with disabilities basically range from anything. Can be the basics of they need an overlay for their papers because the whiteness of the white paper causes them to have headaches, to assistive technology that includes iPads with programs and apps that speak for them. So the IEP is the foundation for providing an educational program for students with disabilities. The Foundations of IDEA, another acronym, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is a federal law. It means zero reject. No school, no institution that receives public funding, government funding, can turn away a student with a disability. It also means free, appropriate public education, which sometimes you may see referred to as FAPE, F-A-P-E. And basically that means that every child has a right to a free, appropriate public education. It's important to note the public portion of this particular acronym because sometimes parents will get frustrated, because I was one of those parents, and want to pull their child out of public education because it isn't serving their child with special needs well. And so when it comes to IDEA, like I said, this federal law, it only covers public education. So the moment, to use myself as an example, and like I said before, I use myself and my son as an example a lot, in this course, the moment I decided I wanted my son to go to a private school, not all of his rights, ADA still applies, but it's a lot harder to get services unless you have like a lot of money to follow your kid around, to be able to make sure that they get a free and appropriate education. Least restrictive environment, LRE, is the acronym for this particular phrase, and it basically means that you always want the child to be in the most least restrictive environment when it comes to their education. So if your child is able to handle a general education classroom all day long with only maybe, say, for instance, an aide to assist them with maybe writing or redirection, then that's appropriate. But when it gets to the point where the child is having a hard time sitting still, he or she is not gaining anything from being in the general education program, or benefiting in some kind of way, or it catering to their developmental growth, they that's when the teacher or the aide, or maybe even sometimes the parent, will say, I would like to have my child assessed, to see what would be the best environment, what would be the least restrictive environment. In education, you always want to strive for the top. You want them hopefully in general education, but in my perspective, it wasn't the best fit for my son, and with his behaviors, and then with the delays that continuing to get further and further behind compared to his general education classmates, the general education classroom was no longer suitable. Non-discriminatory evaluation. This goes without saying, it's very much self-explanatory. When your child or a child is assessed by a school psychologist, it's important that they not engage in any discriminatory practices and or behavior. Due process and procedural safeguards. If you've ever attended a IEP meeting, whether as a school professional or as a parent or as just, a friend, they always hand the parents a copy of the procedural safeguards. This goes over the due process. If you're unhappy with the way your child was assessed, or you're unhappy with the way your child's needs are being met in the school system, there is a process that all school systems have in place so that you can mediate, hopefully, and come to a resolution, and or just to discuss your rights, not only your rights as the parent, but also the rights of the child. And then technology related assistance. As the times continue to improve, technology continues to get better and better for assisting not just individuals with disabilities, with everyone. There is an assistive technology piece in every single phone, laptop, iPad. You can turn on larger text. You can change the background so that it better meets your needs. If you are someone who is prone to getting chronic headaches, sometimes having less of the white light, if you're using a Kindle, that can cause sometimes headaches, and just being able to dim it sometimes helps. Sometimes being able to flip it so it's a black screen with white print helps. So technology related assistance is also available and covered under the IDEA. The Americans with Disabilities Act addresses 4 major areas: private sector employment, public services, public accommodations, not education, telecommunications, and then there's a video that goes along with it as well that I encourage you to look at. The ADA covers everything, regardless to whether you're in school or not, regardless of your age. Americans with Disabilities Act, it is basically what it says, which I love, like the simplicity of things sometimes. Basically, anyone who has a disability is covered under these 4 areas when it comes to having their needs met. So that means including going into a restaurant and having, if you're, say, for instance, completely blind and you engage in the information around you using Braille, the restaurant needs to have some kind of way to communicate what's on their menu to you. Granted, they may not have a Braille menu, but they may have someone available to read the menu for you. Or nowadays, thanks to COVID-19, if you want to say that, a lot of restaurants have their menus online, so you can use your screen reader on your device in order to read the menu, as long as it's not in a picture format like JPEG or PNG. The labeling exercise is really cool, and I'm going to do that in a separate video to show you exactly what that's about. But basically, we're going to talk about some of the significant terms, or those, I don't want to say significant, talk about those terms that are often used with students who are in special education. And as you can see here, I refer to them as SPED. And then you have the terms that are you hear often when you're referring to general education students. And I'm going to, in the video, draw from past classes and the terms that they've come up with. When you're talking to individuals with disabilities, regardless of age, you want to use people first language. You want to say the student with autism or the student with ADHD, the student who has anxiety or things of that nature. You don't want to refer to them as the disabled child or let's see, the ADHD kid, the blind kid. Although in a previous slide, for those who are paying attention, I did write that and then I stated it correctly, but I need to go back and change that, obviously. So you want to be conscious of that. And then once you start to realize how often you do it, you will kind of self-correct. It's really interesting how now I'm more conscious of it. Whereas in the past, prior to having a child on the spectrum, I wasn't as conscious of it. True story, my mom was a special education teacher. So I grew up around individuals with disabilities pretty much all my life. And from the very beginning, she told my sister and I that, we weren't better than the individuals in her classroom and we weren't worse. It was just that we're all different. And it was important that we celebrate all of our differences because we all bring different gifts to the table. And she just made it a thing where we could not be disrespectful. We had to always give them the same level of respect that we give our, good friends. And so growing up, I was just taught that, and it just became a part of who I am. You want to say the person who has, versus, person who has anxiety, person who has bipolar disorder, versus saying suffers from, well, I will say suffers from bipolar disorder or victim of depression. It automatically gives a negative tone there, and you don't want that. You want people to always be open to working with all students as well as open to, embracing their differences. You want to say things like emotional disorder or mental illness. Just say that what it is. You don't want to refer to them as crazy or insane just because they have something going on that may be impacting their behavior or the way you're able to govern your classroom or childcare facility. And then you want to just say the condition. Just say what it is. Everything is not a disease. It's been slightly annoying, not that anyone cares, how they'll refer to COVID-19. No, I'm sorry. They'll refer to the coronavirus as a disease. And it's like, so I understand that the way it's impacting our bodies is definitely the characteristics of a disease, the way the virus is taking over and just, wrecking immune systems. There's no doubt that there's reality in that. But it's just the interchanging of the words. I feel like as soon as, a virus is not a disease, and a disease is not a virus. So using those things using those terms interchangeably can sometimes add to confusion. But then in reality, it may not at all, because people may not even be focusing on it from the same point of view that I am. Lastly, please go in and check out these 3 videos regarding the Individualized Education Program, which is in short, the IEP and 504 plans. 2 things to know about the difference between the two is the IEP is for individuals. Now, a person with a 504 plan, as I jump straight to the second one, 9 times out of 10, based on my experience alone, because the moment I say 9 times out of 10, someone says, well, I know someone, and I get it. Based on my experience alone, a student with a 504 plan, for the most part, spends the majority of his or her day in the general education classroom. The individualized education program students, the IEP students, the students with disabilities that require an IEP tend to have more significantly impacted disabilities. And when I say that phrase, I mean basically their disability is more pronounced in their behavior and the way they learn. So you could have two students with ADHD. One may only need a 504 plan that allows for maybe extended time, and he or she may take their tests, especially the formal tests with a guidance counselor. And then you may have someone with ADHD as well. And the way it presents itself on that student's body may require them to spend, part of their day in the special education classroom, like as in, say for instance, doing pullouts, or when it's time for reading or math, if their ADHD affects their learning to the point where they can't, do simple calculations on paper, then he or she may benefit from being pulled out, going to math class in a different classroom. When it comes to the first steps towards getting one, that video does a great job of talking about the first thing that parents need to do. Sometimes a parent can request it, and or a child care professional and or a teacher can request it as well. When I teach this face-to-face, we talk about different ways to approach it when you think there's a child that might benefit from being assessed. You have to be so careful, right? Because these are our children, and everyone, whether you go into mama bear mode or papa bear mode, no one wants to be told there's something wrong with their child, even if as a parent you're recognizing like, wait, this is a little different. I don't remember my other child doing this, or my cousin's child didn't do this, or you may have heard from the doctor, the pediatrician, like, hey, Caleb should be doing this by now. Is he doing this? And then you realize, but you realize there's a delay, but you don't want to accept that reality. So it's one of those things where in the classroom, we talk about different ways to approach it when, Johnny, that's a pretend student, when Johnny, is not keeping up with his or her peers. And it's not just a slight delay, it's a significant delay. It's a concept that he or she should have grasped, but it still is, maybe showing that he or she has no clue, or maybe is still just processing the whole process of a task. So these are just different things. And then it talks about also who makes up the IEP team, and it's basically everyone involved in the child's education plan. And that can be the teacher, it can also be obviously the parents, hopefully, but the parents can also opt out if they choose to. It could be the occupational therapist if the child needs that, speech therapist, the PE teacher, because you definitely want the child out and moving with their general education peers. And with the IEP team can also include a neighbor, family friend, pastor, anyone who, the parents feels that their input is significant for their child's development. And let's see. So takeaways from chapter 1. What's hilarious about all this is that Daphne told me that best practices is to keep videos under 5 minutes, and here we are knocking on 22. But I'm going to work on it as the weeks go on. Definitely try and plan every assignment this week. Work on your final project every week. Like this week, you need to be selecting your topic and just starting to just maybe look at activities that could help, or things that you can do that you don't mind displaying on a video. Definitely want you to select your disability on the sign up sheet by Sunday. This is not a hard deadline, but at the same time, once the disability topic is chosen, then it can't be chosen by anyone else. Definitely understand the difference between a diagnosis, disorder, and disease and disability. That's listed in its order. You always start with a diagnosis, and then from there it's either disorder or disease, and then you can have both and it not be a disability as long as it doesn't impact any of your major life activities. But the moment either one or both impact one of your major life activities, is then deemed a disability. IDEA, remember the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, only applies to K through 12. It does not apply in higher education. In higher ed, we only get ADA and Section 504 and Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. Use person first language, and IEPs and 504s are only used in K through 12. Higher education uses only accommodation plans. And we don't discuss higher education at all in this course, but because of what I do at Point Loma and have done for the last 7 years, I often refer to it. So I will, this concludes chapter 1. Chapter 2 is up next, obviously, and then from there, I look forward to chatting with everyone on Thursday. Thank you.